Thank you, Oliver. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to tonight's Sagamore Rye Whiskey tasting. We've just posted the tasting order in the chat, so please feel free to start pouring your whiskeys. You'll notice that we have 6 whiskeys for you today, so it's very important that we hammer home the message that it's very important not to drive after this tasting. Please don't do that. We support responsible drinking, and tonight you're the servers, so responsible service of alcohol is on you tonight. Just one more piece of housekeeping. If you've got 6 glasses, please do feel free to jump them into 6 different glasses, so you can come back to the tasters as we go through. You don't have to finish each one as we go. You can feel free to come back and taste, and maybe even skip ahead, but try not to skip too far ahead. After that, we are going to be joined by a very special person from Sagamore Spirit Distillery in Maryland. If you guys have heard anything about Maryland Rye or Sagamore before, you'll know that we've got something very special for you today. We've got not only 6 great whiskies from Sagamore, but a very, very new one to the market here in Australia, which is the Sagamore Small Batch, which is the first product to land on our shores, which is 100% distilled, aged, and bottled in Maryland, in the States. So we'll get into why that's very important. But first, I'd like to welcome Chad Albertson. Chad, welcome to the chat.
Good morning, my time. It's 6 a.m. here on the East Coast of the United States. So good morning. Glad to be here. Thanks for letting me jump in on the tasting and talk a little bit about Sagamore Spirit.
It does look very, very dark wherever you are.
I'm actually in the basement. I'm in a dungeon, so yeah, it's starting to get light out.
We don't really have basements in Australia. It's kind of very much an American kind of thing, unless you're living all the way out in like Broken Hill, where it's too hot to be above the surface. You have to be underground. Awesome. Well, we're going to get straight into tasting and talking about the Sagamore products. So feel free to start nosing the Sagamore Signature, which is whiskey number 1 at 41.5%. And Chad, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your role with Sagamore. And you've been with the company for quite a while, yeah?
Yeah, so I started with the company, I guess about 8 years ago. So I was a distributor person, salesperson, working for a local distributor here in Maryland and DC. I was actually managing the Brown-Forman portfolio. So it's brands like Jack Daniel's and Woodford Reserve. So I was managing their brands for the distributor. I'm born and raised here in Maryland. We have a lot of state pride here. And I heard about this company called Sagamore Spirit that was really looking to put Maryland back on the map as a premier distiller of rye whiskey. So I jumped at the chance, and as I say, I hit a royal flush on the flop and got the first sales position. So I actually launched the brand here in the United States, helped roll the first barrels off the truck that were distilled in Indiana. Then I did some trade marketing for a number of years, and then last year I was doing international sales for the company, team of 1, with some great partners like the Whiskey List. And then in September, we were acquired by Ilva Serrano, Di Serrano, which was super exciting. So we went from a sales force of 1 international to probably about 100 folks now. So yeah, so it's great. So I've been around for a couple years, know a thing or two. And I actually live in Pikesville, which you guys may have heard of, Pikesville Rye, which is another classic Maryland style rye that's made in Kentucky now.
Yeah, that definitely gets to a point that I'm hoping we're going to cover tonight, which is the difference between rye whiskey as it's traditionally known, and maybe now this emergence of or re-emergence of Maryland style. How does kind of Sagamore fit into that Maryland style rye? Maybe could you define what that is for us?
Yeah, so we were super lucky when our founders kind of came up with this concept of bringing back rye to Maryland. They were bourbon drinkers, so they actually loved Woodford and Basil Hayden. So they kind of tended to skew towards the sweeter style of whiskey. So when they started doing research on rye, and they discovered that Maryland was famous for making a sweeter style rye whiskey, they said, "Oh, that's perfect." So Unfortunately, there weren't any mash bills that were written down by distilleries, so nobody wrote down their recipes because they were afraid people were going to steal them. So the research basically, Maryland was known for that sweeter style rye. The conclusion was that it was probably sweeter due to the corn content. So having a little bit more corn content similar to bourbon. So that worked really well with our founders, what they liked, sweeter style rye versus Pennsylvania, is more of like a 95% rye, big, bold, robust flavors from that rye. So that kind of weaved its way into, that Maryland style, that sweeter style rye. And really now what we're really trying to educate people on that, when I say bourbon, most people think of Kentucky, as a region, and Maryland and rye with Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland is very similar to, say, a Scotch, to where you have different regions in Scotland where you have those different taste profiles. So it's kind of much more multi-dimensional than, say, a bourbon that's kind of just Kentucky. Um, you know, so hopefully that works. And, Maryland was the furthest state that was actually growing corn back in the day. So that's why, kind of Maryland style rye had some of that corn in it, just because corn was prevalent back in the day.
Yeah, I've heard lots of different explanations to how that sweeter kind of flavor profile could have come about, all the way from like triple distillation, all the way down to like adding like prune juice concentrate and stuff to actually kind of rectify it.
Yeah, yeah, and the triple distillation really came from our Irish ancestors. The Irish that came over from Europe settled in this region. So Maryland is on the east coast of the United States. So most of the European settlers came over and they settled around this area. And a big part of that in Maryland was German and Irish. So we actually had a lot of breweries as well. So which is one of the reasons we have E in our whiskey is from the Irish, and they also brought their triple distillation techniques. And along with that, they brought some rye seed. So rye is a colder weather crop. So they were growing that in Northern Europe. So they brought those seeds with them and started planting that primarily as a cover crop to tobacco. Tobacco was a big cash crop back in the day in this area.
Yeah,
How are you guys
sure.
liking the signature?
The signature's been doing so well in Australia. Like it's just like it's super soft. Like we get like heaps of marshmallowy kind of notes on the nose.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're gonna get into the double oak a little bit later, but I feel like this is the untoasted marshmallows and the double oak is the toasted marshmallows.
Yes, very much so.
And yeah, I just love that, like as like super approachable rye. You guys kind of this is your core product right from the very start.
Yeah, so this is the one we launched with. I actually joined the company before I actually tasted the whiskey, which I wouldn't always recommend for everybody to do, but I knew it was going to be a good brand. I knew it was going to be a great whiskey. So and I tried it, and it was, really geared towards approachability. So not a lot of people know about rye. So a lot of people are intimidated about rye whiskey. They've heard stories of big, bold, spicy notes, and they're like, we're kind of more bourbon drinkers. At least here in the States. I know internationally Scotch kind of works a little bit better. So people were a little intimidated. Signature was really brought in to bring people into that rye category. So a lot of times we like to say we're the bourbon drinkers rye. So with that 41 and a half ABV, which there's a reason why it's 41 and a half. So here in the States, we use proof. So where it's actually 83 proof here in the United States. And, our founders own a farm north of here, which is where we get our name, called Sagamore Farm. And we actually bring our water from a spring house that's built on that farm down Interstate 83. So that's kind of where they came up with 83. It's different. The co-founders don't come from the spirit business, so they were like, oh, let's do things a little bit different. Like there's a lot of 80 proof things, 82, higher. Let's do things a little bit differently. So that's kind of the story behind that. That's obviously evolved into the next one to where we went up in proof, where I think this one's really landing really, really well. I think it's a little bit more geared towards whiskey drinkers. Still, I think it's approachable and gets people into the rye whiskey world.
Yeah, that's exactly what Noel said in the comments. He says, "I feel this signature could be the perfect gateway ride to non-rye drinkers," and
100%.
we're definitely seeing that. We're definitely seeing that, like Scotch drinkers, if they're going to go into an American whiskey, they might not go straight from a single malt Scotch to a bourbon or even a high rye. They might go to a kind of a softer style rye, like a Kentucky style or a Maryland style.
Yeah, and I think with rye, for us, because we are only focused on rye, that's what we do. It's our bread and butter. Yeah, I think internationally we're still pretty early to market with it. I think, even here in the States, I still have family, um, distant family now, are like, how's that bourbon, doing? I'm like, it's rye, it's not bourbon. But I think internationally there is more and more folks looking at rye, looking to discover that, and I think that plays very well into those, Scotch drinkers looking for something a little bit different for American whiskey that has a little bit more flavor, a little bit more character than some of the bourbons out there.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat from Ian. Does the process require any other grains to help with the rye in the mash bill? So could you
Yeah, it
share maybe
does.
the
So
story of
we
the mash bill?
Yeah, so we actually use a double mash bill. So we use two different recipes. So we use a high rye mash bill, which is 95% rye, 5% malted barley. And that malted barley really is kind of that activation. That's what really kind of gets things going, when it's cooked and it's fermented. So we cook, ferment that, distill that, age that 4 to 7 years. Then we use a low rye mash bill, which is 52% rye, 43% corn. That's where that sweetness comes in, is that corn, and then 5% malted barley. We cook that, ferment that, distill that, or sorry, cook, ferment, distill, age that 4 to 7 years. So we have these two different mash bills, those two different barrels sitting in our warehouse where we have hot summers, cold winters here in the state. So it really gets that interaction into that barrel, drawing those flavors out. And then after it's been aged, we take it down the distillery and we blend those two together at about a 75% ratio of that high rye to that low rye. So great question.
Yeah, awesome. And those recipes themselves, where do those recipes come from?
So our original recipe was it was MGP. So MGP primarily makes two primary mash bills. They do a 95 high rye and a 51% rye, low rye mash bill. So originally we were contract distilling with MGP, which is in Indiana. So our master, well, not our master, our head consultant was a guy named Larry Ebersol. He was actually the master distiller at MGP for a number of years. We like to call him the godfather of rye. Rye's a tough grain to work with, and Larry really kind of mastered how to work with it, how to not get these big clumps when you're cooking it. So we were contract distilling with them, and that basically means we were buying an entire run for them. So contract distilling versus sourcing is very different. Contract distilling, you're paying for that whiskey up front. You're paying for it to be, basically housed, and as it's being aged for 4 to 7 years. So it's a set price versus sourcing, you're paying, it's basically a commodity. So you're paying whatever that market price is for that barrel, and it's already been aged. And you can buy a 5-year barrel, 4-year barrel, but the price will fluctuate. And MGP whiskey is very expensive right now. So we were fortunate enough to have that funding in the beginning to contract distill with MGP. So two different mash bills, and then once we started making our own, we said let's tweak it a little bit and make it of our own to 52.
Yeah, we love the fact that you guys were kind of very transparent with that from the start. It was very much like, this is a collaboration. The ideas came from Larry of how we can even recreate this Maryland style. Is like, let's do something that we can actually achieve straight away and then replicate ourselves further down the line, which is the point we're at now.
Yeah, it's been fun from the beginning. So when we launched, it was very much Sackville Farm is a horse farm, so a thoroughbred horse farm, very, very famous, world renowned. It used to be owned by the Vanderbilt. So it was it was very much like horse racing, and rye whiskey, because we couldn't really talk about Maryland all that much because it was made in Indiana. So we talked about taste profile, and as the brand has evolved over the past 8 years to now, where we're doing our small batch, where it's 100% Maryland, distilled in Maryland, has been really exciting, and it's been great for people to kind of go along that journey with us. As we all know, being transparent in this business is very, very important. There's a lot of non-distillery products out there. Some of them pretend that they have a brick and mortar place, but a lot of them don't. So it's got to be very transparent. Yeah, so I can see the chat as well. So yeah, so we're actually sourcing rye grain from local farms. So 100% of our corn is actually grown at Sagamore Farm. So it's all non-GMO. And then, it was when we got in this business, we honestly thought farmers were going to be like, we want to grow rye for you. This is amazing. We love what you guys are doing. Everyone's going to jump on board and start growing grain for us. And come to find out, nobody wanted to do it. So, the problem was rye is not insured. It's also not subsidized by the U.S. government like corn. So corn's very inexpensive to grow, and making the states back all the way to World War II, to where the U.S. government was basically putting subsidies for farmers to grow corn to make ethanol for the war effort. So we had an issue. We said, all right, how do we get local farmers involved? So one of the things that we did is we actually buy all the grain up front. So we take away that risk for them. The other thing with farming is it's tough, and it's very contingent on how much they bring in. It dictates the price per bushel. So if they have a bad season, they're not going to get that much money per bushel. So we said, you know what, we're going to guarantee the price regardless of how much you bring in per bushel. So we started getting these local farmers involved, and we've seen there's a lot of pride for them. Typically with farming, grain goes out, they have no idea where it goes, and most of the time they don't care. It goes to feed or it goes into whatever the big grain companies, and now they know like their grain is actually being used to make a whiskey that's going around the world, and it's been really fun to work with them, and we're getting more and more interest. To where last year 43% of the grain that was used to make Sagamore rye was actually grown in Maryland. Now, we'll never grow 100% of it here. Very similar to wine. If we have a bad year or bad crop, that kind of puts us in a bad spot. So we're still, sourcing most of our rye from the Midwest and the northern part of the United States.
Yeah, awesome.
We do have some estate grown. So we've got a barrel, a couple barrels laying down of what we call kind of estate or farm grown rye. So where it's 100% rye from Sagamore Farm, all the corn, and actually Maryland oak as well. So
awesome. I think it maybe it'd be a good time to start kind of comparing the two of the 41.5%, the signature, and the small batch, which is the newest release to kind of land on our shores. Very interested to see everyone's comments of the comparison between these two. Obviously, proof being a very first noticeable difference. Different distillery, different state. Is it different warehousing state as well? So most of this product in the signature would have been aged in Indiana.
So I would say probably the whiskey you have, most of it was distilled in Indiana, but a lot of, I would say half of the time was spent in Maryland, versus the small batch, all of it's been aged in Maryland. So we have three different aging barns. So we have two kind of about a half an hour, a couple miles from the distillery, 22,000 barrels and 42,000 barrel warehouse. So that's about 9 levels high. So it really gets that heat up at the top. And that's honestly where we age a lot of our double oak. And then we have a smaller aging barn. It's about 2,200 barrels up at the farm. I get a lot more toffee out of the small batch. I did the tasting the other day, and I was like, wow, that's I'm getting a really nice toffee out of this one.
Yeah, I think a lot of that initial sweetness that I pick up on the signature, on the nose, is kind of slightly pared back, maybe kind of increased by a slight spiciness, which is great. Awesome to highlight the rye grains.
Yeah, I was really impressed
with
the small batch.
Sorry, what was that, Chad?
No, I was gonna say that the signature was great. To me it was a little light. Again, great to get those people kind of in the rye whiskey category, but the small batch really lands for me.
Noel says definitely prefer this to number one. Hard to say if it's just a few more ABV, but carries so much more flavor. Small batch is certainly like a cinnamon swirl, says Ian. Very nice. Yeah, I get that for sure.
My favorite thing, comparing it to, or two things. One, the mouthfeel. It just there's more viscosity in the small batch, and I assume that's coming from the higher ABV. It's not spicier though, which I think is still like quite accessible too. Because of that higher ABV, it handles ice or in a cocktail or in a mixer really good. So whilst the signature, you have to drink it, I think, fairly quickly to kind of enjoy it before the ice and old fashioned melt. I've been doing some testing at home, and the old fashions, you can sit on it a lot longer with a higher ABV. So it's a winner, and I think in both regards.
Yeah, I feel
Yeah,
like
that's
it's
a nice.
still a pretty approachable price point. Not price point. It's the same price point as the signature, higher ABV, same price point. But I feel like it's still an approachable rye, right? It's not a smack you in the face rye. It's still a very approachable rye.
It's one of the great things with rye, and really dating back to, classic cocktails, the Manhattan, the old fashions were all typically made with rye whiskey. And rye holds up so well in those kind of little bit more sweeter, for taste profile cocktails to where they tend to be a little bit sweeter, but that rye and that spiciness holds up really well. So you tend to be a little bit lower proof in those cocktails, because that spice doesn't get lost in it versus bourbon. I think if you do a lower ABV, it tends to kind of fade away to where you're not getting a lot of that taste profile in those kind of sweeter cocktails.
Somehow muted myself. I used to be a bartender, so yeah, those like rye is a mixing ingredient. It's just we absolutely loved it. Just being able to carry body texture, even with dilution. Yeah, obviously, I'm sure you love your Manhattans and things, and we discovered that a black Manhattan works really really well, which is swapping out the vermouth, the sweet vermouth, with Amaro. And you guys actually produced a Amaro a little while back, right?
We do. Yeah, so we decided, and the only reason we did it was really for the Black Manhattan. So our team came up with an Amaro specifically to go with our rye whiskey. It wasn't like, oh, let's make an Amaro. It was like, nope, let's make an Amaro that goes specifically with it. And I don't know how they do it. So they don't let me in the lab anymore after something happened a while back. But they worked on this Amaro, and it's a rye whiskey based Amaro, and it's absolutely fantastic. And specifically just to go in a Black Manhattan. That's one of my
So
favorite
what happened
cocktails.
in the lab? Come on, you gotta give us a little bit more detail on that.
So, like, you walk in, it's, I don't know if you guys have Axe, body wash. So I've got teenage boys, I was out of soap, did some Axe body wash. Not so good in a lab where there's a lot of sensory stuff going on. They're nosing, and then Chad walks in and, blows everybody's noses. So they say, Chad.
Yeah, it's like someone who's like working in the whiskey industry, and they walk in after having a cigarette, and you go, I
Yeah,
can't smell anything now, man.
nope.
Ian says Sagamore must be very on point for sustainable farming. Does that come into your philosophy when it comes to the farming side of things?
I mean, the farming, I think we definitely rely on our farmers to do what they do best. But growing some of our, about 43% of our grain locally does help with that carbon footprint. I think we're very cautious to talk about sustainability in the business that we are in, because distilling is not very environmentally friendly, and we don't want to greenwash anything. So we're very cautious of saying how much, pro environment, things that we're doing, just because in nature distilling is not great. We're producing a lot of carbon out there. So we try to do our part where we can, but it's not something we really promote, just because we don't want to greenwash anything.
No, I really appreciate that. Awesome. Well, I think let's move into whiskey number 3, which is the Sagamore Double Oak. We sometimes tell people at the whiskey shows, if you like your old fashions, just chuck this on ice. It's got it's almost like it's got all these like roasty, like some of those characteristics you expect out of an old fashioned with added bitters. It's got a little bit of extra kind of vanilla kind of characteristics from the secondary aging. It's almost like, and it's a little bit higher ABV as well. So you chuck it on ice and it's almost straight away an old fashioned. So cool.
Yeah, double oak, really is my favorite. And double oak has kind of transitioned over the number of years. So the original story behind double oak is we're working with a cooperage called Independent Stave. And we kind of got to be known for some of our reserve series, some of our finishes. So they knew we liked to try different stuff. So we were a newer distillery. So they reached out and said, hey, we've got this, it's called a wave stave barrel. It's a new technology. We think it's going to draw a little bit more flavors. It's lightly toasted. It's got vertical grooves cut on the inside of the staves. Would you guys like to try it? And we're like, yeah, sure, we'll try anything. So we laid that down, and I think the initial thought was we took our blend of our 2 mash bills after it had been aged for, I think at that point it was probably 4.5, 5 years, dumped it, blended it together, and then put it into this wave stave barrel, and we let that sit for about 9 months. Well, it turned out, when we dumped it, it was great. We went back to the recipe and what it did, and one of our guys actually messed it up and did the wrong blend in it. So, but it came out really well, and we said, okay, it works. So our initial one we released, I think, was about 6 months, and we kept taking that up to now we're 18 months in that wave stave barrel. And again, that's lightly toasted, after it's been aged for 5 years in that charred oak barrel. So it's actually one of our older products on the market. But I think that secondary aging in that toasted wave stave barrel really draws out some great flavors to it. We were talking about marshmallow before. I definitely get great notes of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I find it funny, like it's still technically a straight rye whiskey because it's still aged in a second virgin oak barrel, right?
Yeah.
So the definition of rye being it has to be kind of a straight rye whiskey has to be aged in a virgin oak barrel or oak container, I suppose is the technical term. Could be an oak bucket if you found an oak bucket to age your rye in, but probably not so useful. But yeah, it goes out of a virgin oak container and into a new virgin oak container, obviously prepared like you've suggested. So it's a really cool project. I really like it.
Yeah, it was fun when they came to us with that. So and we've got a great relationship with them, and really we've seen double oak over the last couple of years really take off. We get I think it's a crowd favorite amongst whiskey drinkers.
Roasted seeded toast on the nose and really great on the palate from Ian. Noel, you're gonna have to taste it eventually. S'mores, yep, s'more please. Yeah, this has been a real favorite at the whiskey shows. It's one of those ones where they're as much as we love the story of Maryland Rye, and we believe the product is already kind of pretty exciting as it is. There's not really anything like this on the market here in Australia. There's not really any double oak ryes. There's a double rye from High West, I believe, but there's really not much else on the market that tastes like this. Awesome.
And speaking of s'mores, I don't know, we hear that a lot of s'mores, but really, I don't know if you guys have done this, but in terms of food pairings, like actually making s'mores and tasting them with whiskey is like a life-changing event, because the graham cracker, those baking spices in that graham cracker, the chocolate and that marshmallow goes so well with rye and bourbon. It really helps draw those flavors out. And we're telling people that, like, well, you're not like serious about like eating s'mores while you're drinking whiskey. I'm like, try it. It will blow your mind on the different flavors that you come out. So we've actually done some events at the distillery where it's, we'll do fire pits outside and do s'mores and whiskey, and people, it's always been a blast.
And you guys have a really cool facility, actually. That's probably a good point to mention. You've like the distillery is on the river in Baltimore, right? It's like all right on the riverside.
Yeah, so it's I believe we're the only this distillery in North America that's on the water. So it's a 5 acre waterfront distillery right in Baltimore, right in the city, right along a major highway. And it's built in a kind of one of the largest urban renewal development projects on the East Coast, to where we're really trying to get people to come to Baltimore. Being off Interstate 95, which is a massive thoroughway that goes all the way from Florida to up in Maine on the East Coast. We have millions of drivers driving through Baltimore. So the really goal of putting the distillery right off of that highway and in downtown was to hopefully get people to, instead of driving through Baltimore, is actually to jump off the highway and come visit Baltimore. Baltimore doesn't have the greatest reputation, like a lot of major cities. We've had some challenges with crime. So really the founders were really hoping to try to reframe Baltimore, to change that narrative about the city, and get people to jump off the highway, maybe come see Sagamore Spirit, see the distillery, and then, go out, see the restaurants, and see what Baltimore actually has to offer, that we've got a really cool food scene. We have a great arts community. So it's, my wife was always, she's like, oh, why couldn't you be a doctor? I'm like, one, I'm not that smart. But there's like, having that job that has a purpose, and being raised here in Maryland, and being from this area, we really see, working for Sagamore is not just working for a whiskey company, but kind of having a higher calling, not to get too preachy, but it's like we're really trying to talk about the city and talk about Baltimore and help change that narrative about it, to get people to come here and maybe come back for pleasure, after they come to the distillery. So.
Would you say Baltimore kind of really suffered from that brain drain after Prohibition, where the distillers kind of moved down to Kentucky and decided to make bourbon or whiskey down there instead of whiskey in Baltimore? And did that kind of affect the city as well?
Yeah, I think really, most of the distilleries switch over to make ethanol for World War II. So what I've read and what I've come up with, really kind of the downfall of the rye whiskey movement wasn't because GIs came back from World War II from Europe and their taste changed, but it was really, like everything, you follow the money. So a lot of your distilleries in Kentucky were owned by larger parent companies. So, post World War II, you had some big, we like to call it big whiskey. Rye, because they were older distilleries, most of them were family owned, were like, we're not joining anybody else. So when you have a lot of money tied up with bourbon distilleries in Kentucky, you have more money to lobby the government. So they helped lobby and keep the corn subsidies, which kept that price of corn lower. Rye is expensive because it's harder to make, and the rye whiskey producers that were independent didn't have that lobby to really go to the government to get that price down. So, it was really economics. Corn was cheaper to make. It's cheaper on the shelf. Post World War II, people just looked at price and they started buying more and more bourbon, where eventually they kind of worked themselves out of the market. So I think the last distillery to leave was Majestic, that made Pikesville Rye in the 70s, to leave Maryland. And then that recipe was bought by Heaven Hill. Unfortunately, it's making its way back.
Yeah, I heard a stat from when we were doing these Heaven Hill masterclasses that when Heaven Hill purchased Pikesville, the demand was so low that they had enough rye whiskey distilled already aging on site that they wouldn't have to distill another drop of rye for 12 years. Just there was so much depression in the expectation of bottles of rye ever purchased.
Yeah, I mean, they basically stopped selling to everybody. They had a Pikesville, it was a white label rye. And they basically stopped selling to every other state but Maryland. So we had Pikesville Rye, gosh, I think it was up through probably the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, where we still had Pikesville white label rye on the shelf. And it was interesting. Then they decided to discontinue it and then come back with the green label. I think it's 110 proof, the green label. So yeah. And we're thrilled that Pikesville is, and Heaven Hill's out there talking about it. I'll be a little cheeky. I think 8 years ago, they weren't talking too much about Maryland style rye and Pikesville. We've been banging this drum since we started. And it's nice to see folks actually start embracing that and talking about Maryland style rye more and more.
I feel like I could go really, really nerdy with you two for too long. So
Yeah.
so let's jump into the next whiskey, which is the cask strength, the Sagamore cask strength at 56.1% ABV. It's a
This
bit
is
of a
a
jump from
really fun
48.
one. When I was out on doing sales, I would love to taste folks on this one and not tell them the ABV. Because I think most people are blown away about actually what the ABV is. Because to me, it doesn't come across that it's that high ABV. Cask is about 4 to 7 years, so kind of a range.
So the signature and the small batch that we tasted, those were like about 4 to 6 years old on average.
Yeah.
Is that
Yep.
right? And so the cask strength's a little bit older and a little bit stronger, obviously.
Yeah, and so we'll start taking those age statements up just as all, as our whiskey is. So we want to get our whiskey into the bottle as quickly as possible, but starting a distillery, you're not running 2 shifts a day right out of the gate. So there's a lot of, working through things, what works, what doesn't work, how much can we actually do. But now we're up to the point we're running 2 shifts a day, 7 days a week. So we're cranking out some whiskey. So we have 9 6,500 gallon. I don't know what that is converted to liters, but they're big fermentation tanks. So we can
One
produce
gallon is
about,
about 3 liters.
okay. So we can produce anywhere between 14 and 18 barrels per shift.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. So, as we're blending our own whiskey, we're waiting for that to age, but we wanted to get that in. So, I think that sweet spot typically for rye, and I don't know if everybody agrees, I think generally we hear the consensus that sweet spot for age is like 6 7 years, is really where that rye comes into its own. Yeah, so we've
Yeah.
completely moved away from MGP. So we have not contract distilled, I think, with MGP probably, I'd say 7 years. I think we probably stopped right after the distillery was open, maybe even longer. And now I think we still have some MGP, or barrel selects are still MGP because that's about an 8-year-old rye whiskey. But yes, we're completely moving away from MGP.
I've tasted that 8-year-old release that you did a little while back. That was incredible too.
Yeah.
I'm really hoping to see some more of those kind of things landing in Australia as well.
Yeah,
We've
I've never asked, and I don't do international now. I do, brand experience, but the whiskey list is never texting me about every reserve series, every distillery release only of how we can get it. I'm like, that's not my role anymore, guys. I'm like, I wish I could send you some bottles.
Don't worry, we'll keep hassling you. You'll figure it out.
I would say y'all are probably the most vocal, which is great because that shows me there's interest there. So with it, which is fantastic. So
Yeah,
I think
for
there's
sure.
going to be a lot more interest. We had a lot of folks here the other week from around the world. We actually hosted a lot of people here the other week. So I think there's going to be a lot more interest. So you guys were definitely early on board with Sagamore, which is fantastic.
We're definitely chasing your bottle in bonds as well. That's super exciting
Yes.
for us.
Oh,
So you guys now, how old is your bottle in bonds that you're putting out? You're 5 years old now?
yeah, I think it's 5 years old. So yeah, we released that during a big event. So one of the things with distilleries, when you're distilling, you're not putting in your own whiskey into the bottle. People are like, we want to try it. Like, how's it going? We want to taste it. So we came up with this idea for what's called pennies proof. So, people want to taste it and we're like, all right, it's not really ready yet, but okay, we'll invite you in and you can taste it. So we did, a big event. I think it was about 700 boxes and the box had 3 200 milliliter bottles and it was our 2.5-year-old rye whiskey. So it was all the same, but it was 3 bottles. One was to sip right away. One is to share with a friend and one was to save for later. So we did the 2.5-year-old release. People showed up. They paid a penny for it. That's it. pennies are the name of our still. And then we did a 3.5-year-old and then a 4.5. So they could do a vertical tasting. So they could actually taste 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 to see that progression of that. And then that's when we released our bottle and bond was at the 4.5, which I think at that point it was 5 years old. So it was fun. It turned into a really cool community event. When we first did it, we weren't sure if anybody was going to show up. People showed up like 6 o'clock in the morning for a 9 o'clock release. And then the following year, people were in line at like 9 p.m. the night before, hanging out overnight, sharing bottles, some a little bit too much, but it's turned into this really fun event, for what we call our whiskey thief. So if, we'll do a quick plug. If you haven't signed up to be a whiskey thief, go on our website. We send out newsletters, about once a month, kind of what's happening, some distillery exclusives, and some other reserve series, and then what's happening at the distillery.
Nice. Well, there's a question from Chris in here, which is, what's the turnover of barrels to bottles? I'm assuming maybe that's like, what kind of yield are you getting out of an average barrel in Maryland?
Yes, we're getting anywhere between 32 and 34, so it's a 52-gallon barrel. So I get a new charred oak barrel, American oak. So that's on average. I think we get about 10% evaporation the first year, then about 6% every year after that, for the angel share. So because we do have those hot summers and those cold winters here in Maryland.
So you get
the
maybe
aging process, very different than Scotland, where it's much cooler climate. Here in Maryland, similar to Kentucky, that those hot weather, really helps that whiskey absorb into that barrel. And then that cold weather gets cold, pushes that whiskey out. So the interaction in that barrel back and forth, we get those flavor notes, big robust flavors in a much shorter time period than, say, a Scotch.
and then maybe what, like 250 bottles kind of yield?
Yeah.
Nice. Alrighty. Well, I think it's time to move into one of the special editions, which I believe most of the people in the chat might not have had a chance to try yet. This is the sherry finish that we're going to move into now. Whiskey number 5 at 53% ABV. We've gone down a touch, but obviously we've probably punched up a little bit of sweetness. Could you tell a little bit about where you're getting those barrels from and what type of sherry we're talking about?
Yeah, see, these are PX sherry barrels. So you're gonna get some really nice velvet notes out of it. I think that's one you have. We actually have 2 different sherries, but I'm pretty sure you have the PX. So this is our 4-year-old rye whiskey. Oh, sorry about that. So as I say, our 4-year-old straight rye whiskey, and then it's 18 months in a 132-gallon PX sherry barrel, or I believe they call those butts.
Yep, got the PX one here.
Yeah, PX, yep.
The color on it is awesome.
Yeah.
Are we talking like a couple of months finish, or is it kind of shorter than that because your climate's so hot?
18 months in that sherry finish. So in that sherry barrel. So yeah. Yeah, we let it sit in there a while. And so the initial sherry cask was actually just a distillery only release. So kind of our kind of cadence, so to speak, is our distillers will, find the finish. We'll do a distillery only release, see how it goes, and then if it does well, then we'll kind of release that to the greater market. Yeah, date pudding.
Yeah, so much spice in the palate, which kind of helps to carry like some of that sherry sweetness, but it's definitely not like overly sweet. Yeah, those Pedro Jimenez finishes can often end up being just a bit too saccharine. So that I think the ABV that you brought this out at is really, really awesome. I really, it's always sad when you see a distillery release, which you think, oh, I wish this was a higher ABV, but I think this is spot on where it should be. If you brought it out at
Yeah, it's
45% ABV, we'd be so annoyed.
yeah, that's well, I'm not drinking. It's 6 a.m. here, so it's almost 7 a.m. So that's why I'm not drinking. Um, yeah, it's early. That's one of the things with our distillers, with our tasting panel is, you hear a lot of people, consumers like the higher ABV. But a lot of times you go higher in ABV, you do lose some of that flavor. So our distillers are very, very cautious about, wanting to get enough flavor with a higher ABV, but not getting it clouded with heat, so to speak. I remember I think it was our second year on the market. And I was at a large whiskey event in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And a guy named Jimmy Russell, and Eddie Russell were there from Wild Turkey, and they were actually at our booth next to us. And it was before we were open. Eddie came over and said, "Oh, I've heard great things about Sagamore." I was like, "Oh my gosh, you actually have heard of us? This is amazing." Because we're, small distillery. And he tried our lineup, and he's like, "You know what?" He's like, "I've been, a master taster for years." He goes, "I actually think too many people go high in ABV." He goes, "You lose so much flavor of it because it's just clouded in alcohol and heat." And he's like, "I love that you guys really have that range between, the eight, and at that point it was that 41 and a half ABV to that 61 ABV with our cask strength."
So that's
Yeah,
the
so we're
top.
experimenting. I'm sorry, go ahead, Scott.
It's all right. I was just saying, is that the top ABVs that you're seeing in your warehouse, like in the 61%? That's kind of where it's top petering out.
Yeah, no, we're a little bit higher. So I think a lot of our stuff, I was up at our aging barn. It was, yeah, I guess it was 63, maybe a little bit lower. So, close, right in that range.
Yeah, sorry, you're about to answer Andrew's question. Experimenting with any other barrel types or finishes?
We have so much stuff. Like every time I go to the aging barn, I see new things. So we've got our farm stock. We've done cognac. We've got an Albarino finish that we just came out with. We've done tequila finish, rum finish. We've done a whole bunch of local beer releases. So typically your stout kind of heavier beers tend to play really well being aged in our whiskey barrels and then getting those back. So typically what we'll do is we'll send our barrels out. They'll do a beer finish at their local brewery. We bring the barrels back after they've had beer and aged in it, and then we'll refill those with whiskey to kind of do a little finish where we're getting a couple of those notes from having that beer in there. But yeah, they're always messing around with stuff. Different sherry finishes. Now that we have a great partnership with an Irish whiskey called the Busker, I'm sure there's going to be some great collaboration with those folks. I had a lot of really great conversations with them, and really the innovation that the two of us can do working with each other is going to be really, really fun.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if the flavor profile of the spirit, like Sagamore, is on average kind of like a little bit more of a softer rye, flavor profile than, let's say, an Indiana rye, and that might actually lend itself even better to finishing in different kind of products than, yeah, like a really big, bold, rich spice bomb of a rye. You put that into a sherry cask, and you kind of, yeah, it's just big flavors on big flavors. But with the Sagamore spirit being a little bit more soft and kind of rounded, you chuck that into a few different kind of cask finishes, and it plays a little bit more better together. It's not one fighting to kind of dominate over the other.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think complementing flavors. It's like bartending. You can't have big robust flavors and cooking or anything competing with each other, because one's going to win out, or it's just going to be a complete disaster and a mess because it's not going to be very pleasant to taste. So that sweeter style rye definitely, I think, plays really well with our finishes.
That's a great transition. Speaking of bartending, into whiskey number 6, the Manhattan finish. I'm really excited to taste this one.
Yeah. So the
Oh no,
Manhattan finish.
sorry, I lie. This is not the
I was,
Manhattan finish.
I was gonna say I
I thought
didn't
to
have that on
myself,
the list, but I'll talk about it because that's a fun project.
you can tell I'm excited to taste it.
Yeah, so you guys are doing barrel select next?
We are.
And I can talk about Manhattan finish if you guys
You
have it.
better. You
Or
better.
you guys are gonna be like, don't talk about it, we don't have it. So the
I think we're
Manhattan
going to try
finish.
and announce some events soon with the
Okay.
Manhattan finish being in the lineup.
Yeah, the Manhattan finish, obviously it's a popular cocktail. So our distillers had this idea like, well, let's, how can we do like a Manhattan finish? And we didn't want to do like an RTD. Like there's some other brands out there that's lower proof and it's basically they're like, yeah, it's a Manhattan in a bottle. And it is, it's got the mixers and everything in it. And we said, you know what? No, we want to do like a whiskey drinker's Manhattan to where it has the components of a Manhattan, but it's not lower proof and it's not really meant to replace a Manhattan cocktail. It's actually made to like really enhance a Manhattan cocktail. So they basically deconstructed that cocktail. So we did cherry brandy. We took our 4-year-old rye whiskey, put it in a cherry brandy finish barrel, and let that sit for a while. And then we did a vermouth barrel, and then we did a bitters barrel. So we've got these 3 different barrels with our rye whiskey sitting there aging, and then we took it and brought it back, blended it together. It took a long while to try to figure out what that ratio is because you're playing with 3 different very unique flavor barrels trying to come up with what tastes like a cocktail. So not the easiest thing. And it's done really well. I think it's slotted for annual release. Which is exciting. And then to try to outdo themselves, they then try to do it again, but with an old fashioned. So and they just couldn't get it right. So they used actually orange wine, which I had never heard of. I've been in the business for like 17. I'm like, orange wine. I'm like, is that even a thing? And apparently it is. So they used an orange wine barrel and the flavors just didn't work. So they came up with, I forget, there was a distillery exclusive and I forget the name of it. Rana barrels. Yes.
Amberana. Yeah.
Yes. It was our finish. So I was like, well, what was the, because I love stories. And I was trying to understand, I was like, well, what's the story behind it? They're like, well, it was actually, we're trying to make it was the old fashioned finish, but we just couldn't get it right. So we just did, Naranja barrel finish. I was like, well, that's a fun story. They're like, no, you're not supposed to tell people that, Chad. I'm like, no, but that's cool to say, hey, we couldn't get it right. So we changed the name, but it's got some of those orange flavors of it. So long story short.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the daiquiri finished and the
Yeah, cinnamon,
all the
big
different
cinnamon flavor.
cocktails we're gonna get through.
Yeah. Is Fireball big
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Australia? Yeah. We had like I
Oh,
heard
yeah,
hints
it's
of
pretty big.
that. Yeah. So, having our founders and honestly a lot of our marketing team not being in the spirits business at all, that we had very, very early on there were some people talking about different flavors. I was like, no, let's stay away. I'm like, flavors are great, but let's stay away from the actual like flavored whiskey. Yeah, and unfortunately we didn't go down that route.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about the whiskey that we are actually drinking, and not the one that I was. So we're in the Barrel Select, which is bottled at 55% ABV.
Yeah, so Barrel Select, this is kind of our so to speak, what's called our single barrel. It's still not a single barrel, so it's a blend of our high rye and our low rye at an 80-20 ratio. So it's 80% of that 95% rye, 5% malted barley, and 20% of that low rye, that 43 or 52, 43, 5% rye, and then it's blended, the ABV. And this one is typically the accounts and clubs actually get to choose this one. So they typically will get 4 different barrel selects to taste from, and then they get to pick which one. I actually have one later on today in a couple hours with a whiskey group. So it's fun. It's just a little bit of a twist, and this is all about 7 or 8-year-old whiskey. So it is some of the oldest product that we have on the market.
Yeah,
Which one?
super
Which
luscious.
barrel do you guys have? What account got this, or is it kind of a variety?
That's a great question. Probably best for Ollie. Maybe I can
Let
check and
me
see our
let me
note.
try and track it down.
I was just curious. Not that I would remember.
So Ollie, I hear we're all doing a staff-wide trip to go and select a few barrels. Yeah? Thumbs up. I'm going to take that. Take that to the bank.
Yeah, it's only, what is it, 20-hour flight at least?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Question from Ian. That's a really interesting one. Does anybody get a slight mint note? That's a really traditional kind of Indiana tasting note, actually, right? On
It is.
rye whiskey, a little bit of mint. Do you reckon that's potentially coming from the extra age?
From my understanding, yeah. You know, I hear slight mint, and then I saw somebody else made a note about pickles too. You know, very traditional kind of Indiana, flavor notes.
Which is really cool because it's almost like well, yeah, I suppose this is probably mostly Indiana product in
It's
this
all
one here.
Indiana product. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, really the traditional flavor notes, but like
Yeah.
with your own kind of twist on it. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Jimmy says, "Is it barrel 131?" You remember barrel 131, don't you, Chad?
I do, especially what year it was. Yeah, I managed the barrel program for a number of years, and now actually one of my responsibilities is when people come in here, I get to host them and go through the barrel tasting with them with a good friend of mine that I work with.
Awesome. Well, I reckon we've gone through 6 pretty cool whiskeys, and it's time for everybody to vote. I'm going to just launch the poll. So please feel free to add, you can, I believe you can answer your top 2. You don't have to pick just one. You can pick 2 of your favorites. And we've also done a second bonus question for tonight, which is particularly out of the signature and the small batch, the signature being the original distillate. Do you prefer the signature of 41.5%, or do you prefer the small batch, which is 46.5%? And Chad, they can't see these results yet, so don't spoil the fun. We'll let those all roll in. But
I completely forgot to add the sherry option. So if you'll give me 1 second, I will reset it. So give me a minute. Sorry.
everyone have to vote again.
Yep, hold on. That's my bad. I have no idea why I did that. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the nose in this barrel select. That mid 50s in proof point. I think that's just a really amazing point to be drinking rye, particularly single barrels and very specific flavor profiles. So they often like really pop around that mid 50s.
Yeah, and this one actually came from Ollie sent me a photo of it. Actually, it was our distillers picked this one out. So it was a distillery exclusive. So it wasn't a club or anything.
So
Awesome.
you guys, your master distiller picked this from the rick house and just bottled it, basically, yeah?
Yep.
Ollie, I'm noticing in the bonus question you didn't add a third option, which was ¿Por qué no los dos? Why not both?
That last question is complete bias. We know already which one's the better one. I just wanted to see what people were voting.
All right, we've got 2 more people to put their votes into the polls. If you got a second, otherwise we'll share very soon. One person to go. All right, too slow. We're going to share that now. Here's the results. The sherry finish. I'm glad you actually added that to the poll there, Ollie, because that was the favorite. 64%, 9 out of 14 voted for the sherry finish, followed by barrel select, followed by double oak. And then the bonus question, the signature did well, but a small batch absolutely blew it out of the water. So that's a really exciting endorsement for the direction of Sagamore, in my opinion. So congratulations, Chad. That's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, we love getting feedback, and which is why we do those distillery exclusives. To get that feedback from consumers and from fans. We definitely don't like living in an echo chamber of where our distillers are just, we're gonna do what we want. It's like, no, we like feedback. Especially being a new distillery, not so new anymore, but in the early days of really, listening to what consumers are looking for.
So what we're hearing is Australian next exclusive from Sagamore's a sherry cask, finish.
I can tell you whatever you want to hear, but it makes no difference. So we'll see.
I'll let
Australia's
you.
a big whiskey market, so I think that's the nice thing. So I joke, but the nice thing about, even though we are part of the DiSerrano family now, it is family-owned company. So to have that ability to still act as a smaller kind of independent distillery, to be able to pivot and change and come up with innovation, they've been so encouraging and so supportive of those things versus kind of big whiskey. The big whiskey companies, it takes a little bit longer to steer the ship, to pivot, to move. And we can be, I don't want to say reactionary, but we can be, really challenge the team to come up with different things and say, hey, here's what we're seeing on the market, and react pretty quickly to it.
Awesome. Well, we're going to say a big cheers to Chad. Thank you very much for joining us so early in the morning. And cheers to everybody for joining us. Thank you very much. And we'll catch you at the next one.
Thanks so much for having me.
If anybody wants to stick around, feel free. We can open the floor. I'm sure Chad's got an actual work day to get to. But if anybody wants to unmute and ask any questions, we've stopped the recording. We can stick around and finish off our whiskeys if that's what I need to do at least.